Welcome to Reach Pharmacy Health Talks.
Okay, so is it just me, or does that first hint of winter always come with the sniffles? One minute you're enjoying a pumpkin spice latte, and the next you're reaching for the tissues wondering, is this a cold, or is the flu about to knock me out?
It's the age-old question, isn't it? As soon as those leaves start to turn, we find ourselves bracing for that inevitable wave of winter bugs.
Exactly. So today, we are diving deep into the science behind those pesky colds, the flu, and even some lesser-known respiratory illnesses that tend to pop up this time of year.
We'll be separating fact from fiction, exploring why these illnesses seem to thrive in colder weather, and looking at what you can do to stay healthy this season.
And we've got a great lineup of sources to guide us today. We have insights from the Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins Medicine, the World Health Organization, and even some intriguing research from the Canadian Medical Association Journal.
A well-rounded approach to understanding these common health concerns.
I like it. So let's start with the one we've all encountered way too many times, the common cold. The Cleveland Clinic had some stats that really put things in perspective for me. Apparently, adults can expect to catch 2 to 3 colds every year.
And for kids, that number jumps to 4 or more. No wonder it's called the common cold.
Seriously, it's practically a rite of passage in childhood. But even knowing it's common, it doesn't make those sniffles any more fun.
Definitely not. And what's interesting is that while we often attribute colds to rhinoviruses, over 200 different viruses can cause those familiar cold symptoms.
200? Are you serious? No wonder it feels like we're constantly battling something new.
It's true. And to make matters even trickier, the Cleveland Clinic source pointed out that we're contagious even before we start showing symptoms. In fact, you can be contagious for up to 2 weeks.
Talk about sneaky. So before we even realize we're under the weather, we could be spreading those cold viruses far and wide. I guess it makes sense now why they spread so quickly, especially during those long winter months when we're all huddled indoors.
Exactly. We're often most contagious before we even feel sick enough to stay home and rest. And speaking of how colds progress, the Cleveland Clinic source did a great job of breaking down the 3 stages of a cold, which can help us understand what to expect and when those symptoms might hit their peak.
Okay, let's unpack those stages. I'm always curious about the science behind how our bodies react to these viruses. What's going on during that initial stage?
Well, it typically starts with that telltale scratchy throat, perhaps a bit of sneezing and a runny nose. This is usually within the first 3 days of being exposed to the virus.
Ah, yes, the dreaded tickle in the throat. It's like the body's way of saying, get ready, something is brewing.
Exactly. And this is where being mindful of those early signs can be so important. Taking precautions like hand washing and even considering staying home if you're feeling a bit off can help prevent spreading those germs further.
Good advice. So what happens next? When do things really ramp up?
That brings us to the active stage, usually around days 4 to 7. This is when you might experience those full-blown cold symptoms, body aches, headaches, fatigue, and potentially even a fever, especially in children.
So that's when those sniffles turn into the I need to camp out on the couch with a mountain of tissues phase.
Precisely. And during this active stage, prioritizing rest and hydration is crucial. It's your body's way of saying, I need all my resources to fight this off, so listening to those cues can really make a difference in how quickly you bounce back.
Rest and fluids it is. Now what about that final stage? When can we expect some relief?
Well, typically by days 8 to 10, you'll start to feel things winding down. But there's a catch, and the Cleveland Clinic source pointed this out. That nagging cough can linger for weeks, sometimes even up to 2 months.
Seriously, 2 months?
Yeah.
That seems a bit excessive even for a cough.
I know. It can be incredibly frustrating. But it's usually a sign that your body is still working hard to clear out that last bit of infection.
Okay, so patience is key. I can do that, especially if it means getting rid of this cough eventually. But let's shift gears for a bit and talk about the flu. Unlike the common cold, which tends to be more of an annoyance, the flu has a reputation for packing a serious punch.
It absolutely does. And our source from Johns Hopkins Medicine painted a very clear picture of what that looks like. Flu symptoms hit you hard and fast.
We're not talking about a gradual onset here.
Not at all. Think high fever, chills, body aches that make you feel like you've run a marathon, and a level of fatigue that can be completely debilitating. It's a whole different ballgame compared to a common cold.
Wow. That sounds intense. No wonder people dread getting the flu.
And the World Health Organization, WHO, really puts things in perspective on a global scale. Their data highlights that influenza causes millions of severe illnesses every single year.
Millions? Wow, I knew it was a big deal, but I had no idea it was on that scale.
It's a stark reminder that the flu is not something to be taken lightly. It can have very serious consequences, which is why prevention, especially vaccination, is so crucial.
Absolutely. I think we often underestimate the impact of these respiratory illnesses until we or someone we know gets hit hard.
Very true. And this is where understanding the key differences between a cold and the flu becomes crucial. Johns Hopkins Medicine emphasized that recognizing those distinctions can be life-saving, especially when it comes to knowing when to seek medical help.
Okay, so let's talk about those telltale signs. What are some key things that scream flu rather than just a run-of-the-mill cold?
Well, as we've touched on, the flu tends to hit you like a ton of bricks. That rapid onset of high fever, chills, and those intense muscle aches are all red flags. With a cold, you might have a low-grade fever, but it's less common and usually not as severe.
So if you wake up feeling like you got hit by a truck, it's probably not just a case of the sniffles.
Probably not. And the fatigue associated with the flu is also much more pronounced. It's that feeling of utter exhaustion that can make even the simplest tasks feel impossible.
And I imagine those muscle aches don't help matters much either.
Not at all. They can be incredibly debilitating with the flu. Now, while both a cold and the flu can cause a cough, it tends to be more severe and persistent with the flu. You might also experience chest discomfort or shortness of breath, which are less common with a cold.
Okay, so those are some pretty clear distinctions to watch out for.
Yeah.
But what about those times when you're not sure? I mean, sometimes it feels like a guessing game.
You're right, it can be tricky, especially in those early stages. And that's where the guidance from Johns Hopkins Medicine comes in handy. They recommended seeking medical advice if your cold symptoms persist beyond a few days, if they worsen unexpectedly, or if you develop new, concerning symptoms.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's always better to err on the side of caution. What about for the flu? When should we be picking up the phone to call the doctor?
They highlighted seeking care immediately if you have a high fever that's not responding to medication, if you're experiencing difficulty breathing, or if you have any underlying medical conditions that might put you at higher risk for complications.
So basically, trust your gut. If something feels off, don't hesitate to reach out to a healthcare professional.
Exactly. It's always better to be safe than sorry. Now, while we're on the topic of colds and flu, we've got to address some of those age-old myths that seem to circulate every winter.
Oh, you mean like those home remedies that Grandma swore by but never seem to actually work?
Exactly. And luckily, our source from the Canadian Medical Association Journal tackled some of the big ones. Let's start with zinc.
Ah, zinc. I've heard so many mixed things about it over the years. Some people swear by it, while others say it's a waste of time. What's the verdict?
Well, there is some intriguing evidence to suggest that oral zinc might help reduce the duration of cold symptoms, but the research is still somewhat inconclusive.
So there's a chance it might help, but no guarantees.
Pretty much. But here's where it gets interesting. Nasal zinc is a completely different story.
Wait, hold up. Nasal zinc, like you snort zinc up your nose?
Yep, that's the one. But while it might sound like a good idea in theory, the research has actually linked nasal zinc to a significant risk of permanent loss of smell.
Whoa. Permanent loss of smell. That's a pretty hefty price to pay for a slightly shorter cold.
Exactly. So the bottom line is, while oral zinc might have some potential benefits, it's best to steer clear of those nasal sprays.
Noted. Okay, what about vitamin C? That's another one that everyone seems to have an opinion on.
Oh, absolutely. Vitamin C has a long-standing reputation as being the go-to remedy for fighting off colds. But unfortunately, the scientific evidence just doesn't support those claims.
Wait, really? So all those years of downing orange juice and vitamin C supplements were for nothing?
Well, not exactly for nothing. Vitamin C is still important for overall health and a healthy immune system. However, studies haven't definitively shown that it can actually prevent or treat colds.
So it's more about supporting your body in general rather than being a magic cure for the common cold.
Exactly. And it's understandable why this myth persists. Vitamin C has been linked to good health for so long that it's become ingrained in our minds as the go-to solution for anything immune-related.
Plus, there's something appealing about a simple, natural remedy.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, in this case, the science just doesn't back it up.
Okay, so we've debunked zinc and vitamin C. What about honey? I feel like every time I had a cough as a kid, my mom would give me a spoonful of honey.
Honey is an interesting one. There's actually some evidence to suggest that it might be helpful in soothing coughs, especially for kids. It seems to work by coating and soothing the throat, which can provide some relief from that persistent tickle.
So there's actually some scientific backing for that home remedy.
There is, But, and this is a big but, it's crucial to remember that honey is not safe for infants under 1 year old.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Why is honey unsafe for babies?
Honey can contain spores of a bacteria that can cause infant botulism, which is a very serious condition. So as tempting as it might be to reach for the honey, when your little one has a cough, it's essential to avoid it until they're at least 1 year old.
Wow, that's incredibly important information for parents to know. I had no idea.
It's definitely something to be aware of. And speaking of kids, that same article from the CMAJ mentioned another fascinating finding about probiotics. One study found that giving kids a specific probiotic strain, Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, while they're in the hospital, actually reduced their risk of getting a respiratory infection.
Wait, really? Probiotics can help prevent respiratory infections.
That's what the research suggests. It highlights how interconnected different aspects of our health can be. It seems that a healthy gut microbiome might play a role in supporting our immune system and our ability to fight off those pesky viruses.
That is so cool. I love learning about these unexpected connections within the body.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize how much we still don't know about how these complex systems interact.
Exactly, and it opens up a whole new world of possibilities for prevention and treatment.
It certainly does. But before we get too carried away with the possibilities of probiotics, let's tackle another big question that's probably on everyone's minds right now. Why is it that we seem to get bombarded with these respiratory illnesses in the winter? Is it just about being stuck inside more, or is there something else going on?
That's a great question, and one that all of our sources touched on. And you're right, being stuck inside with everyone's germs definitely plays a role.
Like a giant petri dish of recirculated air and shared surfaces.
Exactly. Indoor crowding, especially during the winter months when we're spending less time outdoors, creates the perfect environment for those viruses to spread like wildfire. And remember how we talked about that long contagious period even before symptoms show up? It's a recipe for rapid transmission.
Makes sense. And what about dry air? My grandma always swore by a humidifier in the winter, claiming it helped keep those colds at bay.
There's definitely something to that. Our sources, particularly the Cleveland Clinic, highlighted that dry air, especially in heated buildings, can irritate our airways and make us more susceptible to infection.
So Grandma was onto something. I love it when those old wives' tales turn out to have some scientific backing. But the Cleveland Clinic also had a theory that I found kind of mind-blowing.
What's that?
They suggested that cold temperatures themselves might actually make it harder for our bodies to fight off viruses.
You're right. That is pretty amazing. They did a fascinating study in mice, and it turns out that when cooler air lowered the temperature inside the mouse's noses, their immune systems had a harder time stopping the rhinovirus from replicating.
Wow, so it's not just about being around more sick people. It's like the cold itself is giving those viruses a home field advantage.
Precisely. It really highlights how interconnected our environment and our health truly are.
It certainly does. Now, before we wrap things up, our Johns Hopkins source mentioned that colds and flu aren't the only respiratory illnesses to watch out for during the winter months. They mentioned a few others that we should probably be aware of, especially when it comes to our more vulnerable family members.
Right. They highlighted RSV, which stands for respiratory syncytial virus. It's very common and usually causes mild cold-like symptoms in adults and older children, but it can be particularly tough on infants, young kids, and older adults.
So something else to watch out for with the little ones, especially during their first winter season.
Exactly. And then there's bronchitis, which is an inflammation of the airways and the lungs.
Bronchitis always sounds so scary, especially that cough.
It can definitely be unpleasant. That persistent cough is a hallmark symptom, and you might experience wheezing and shortness of breath, too. Bronchitis can be triggered by a virus, bacteria, or even irritants like smoke or air pollution.
So it's not always directly related to having a cold or the flu.
Not necessarily, no. And finally, we have pneumonia, which is a more serious lung infection.
Pneumonia is definitely one you don't want to mess around with.
Very true. It can range in severity from mild to life-threatening, and it's often caused by bacteria, viruses, or fungi. Pneumonia typically requires medical attention and, in some cases, even hospitalization.
So even though it's easy to brush off every sniffle as just another cold, it's important to pay attention to those more serious symptoms and know when to seek medical advice.
Absolutely. And speaking of seeking medical advice, I found an interesting point in the Reach Pharmacy source that got me thinking. They talked about how online pharmacies are making healthcare more accessible, especially for people who might have difficulty getting to a doctor's office or pharmacy.
That is interesting. And it seems especially relevant now with more and more people relying on telehealth and virtual care. But how does this tie into preventing the spread of winter illnesses?
Well, if people can easily access over-the-counter medications, reliable information about their symptoms, and even virtual consultations with healthcare professionals from home, they might be less likely to venture out into public spaces while they're contagious.
That's a great point. It could be a game changer, especially for people who might otherwise feel pressured to tough it out and go to work or school while they're sick because they can't easily get to a doctor.
Precisely. It's a fascinating thought to consider as we navigate the challenges of cold and flu season in our increasingly digital world.
It really is. It really puts things in perspective. Okay, so we've talked about the common cold and the flu, but what about those other respiratory illnesses that Johns Hopkins mentioned? Those can be especially worrisome for younger kids and older adults, right?
Absolutely. One that they highlighted is RSV, which stands for respiratory syncytial virus. It's incredibly common, and for most healthy adults and older kids, it causes mild cold-like symptoms.
So nothing too out of the ordinary for them.
Right. But RSV can be a much bigger concern for infants, young children, and older adults. Their immune systems might not be as equipped to fight it off, so it can lead to more serious complications like bronchiolitis, which is inflammation of the small airways in the lungs, or pneumonia.
That makes sense. It's like their bodies are still learning the ropes when it comes to fighting off these new viruses.
Exactly. And because their airways are smaller, any inflammation can make it harder for them to breathe.
So those are the times when a trip to the doctor is definitely in order.
Absolutely. If you notice a young child or older adult struggling to breathe, having difficulty feeding, or showing signs of dehydration, it's crucial to seek medical attention right away.
Got it. RSV sounds pretty intense, especially for those vulnerable groups. What about bronchitis? I always associate that with a nasty cough.
You're not wrong. A persistent cough is definitely a hallmark of bronchitis, which is basically inflammation of the bronchial tubes, the airways that carry air to and from your lungs. Along with that cough, you might experience wheezing, shortness of breath, chest tightness, and fatigue.
It sounds pretty miserable. Is bronchitis always caused by a virus like a cold or the flu?
Not necessarily. While viruses are a common culprit, bronchitis can also be triggered by bacteria or even exposure to irritants like smoke, dust, or air pollution.
So it's not always directly linked to being sick with a cold or the flu.
Exactly. Sometimes it's more about those environmental triggers irritating the airways and causing inflammation.
Good to know. Okay, and last but not least, we have pneumonia. That one always sounds a bit scarier.
Pneumonia is definitely more serious. It's an infection that causes inflammation in the air sacs in one or both lungs. Those air sacs, called alveoli, are where your blood takes in oxygen. So when they're inflamed and filled with fluid, it can interfere with your breathing and your body's ability to get enough oxygen.
That sounds, well, pretty terrifying, to be honest. What causes pneumonia? Is it all bacterial?
It can be caused by a variety of things, actually. Bacteria, viruses, and even fungi can all lead to pneumonia. Bacterial pneumonia is often more serious and requires treatment with antibiotics. Viral pneumonia, on the other hand, is often milder and might not need specific medication.
So how do you know which type of pneumonia you might have? I'm guessing a trip to the doctor is the best course of action.
Absolutely. Self-diagnosing is never a good idea, especially when it comes to something as potentially serious as pneumonia. If you suspect you or someone you know might have pneumonia, it's crucial to seek medical attention right away.
Okay, good to know. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the common cold to some lesser-known but equally important respiratory illnesses. Before we move on, is there anything else you think is important to remember about this whole category of winter bugs?
I think the key takeaway is that knowledge is power. By understanding the differences between these illnesses, the ways they spread, and the potential complications they can cause, we can make more informed decisions about protecting ourselves and our loved ones.
I love that. Knowledge is power. It's like having a secret weapon against those pesky winter viruses. And speaking of knowledge, I have to admit, I'm fascinated by this whole idea of cold temperatures actually hindering our immune response. That just blows my mind.
It is pretty incredible, isn't it? That study from the Cleveland Clinic really challenges our assumptions about why we tend to get sick more often in the winter. Of course, we've always known that being indoors and around more people increases our risk of exposure.
Right, because those viruses love a captive audience.
Exactly. But to think that the cold itself might be giving those viruses a helping hand is pretty wild.
It's like they have a secret weapon of their own.
Yeah.
Okay, so what can we do about it besides, moving to a tropical island for the winter?
Well, short of relocating to warmer climates, there are still plenty of things we can do to support our immune systems and minimize our risk of getting sick. And luckily, our sources provided some great insights into effective prevention strategies.
Okay, let's hear them. I'm all for simple, yet effective ways to dodge those winter bugs. What's the first line of defense?
It might seem obvious, but hand washing is truly your superpower in this battle. It's one of the simplest yet most effective ways to prevent the spread of germs, including those nasty cold and flu viruses.
I'm happy to hear that because I'm a bit of a germaphobe and I'm not afraid to admit it. But seriously, hand washing is something we can all do more of, especially during those peak cold and flu months.
Absolutely. And it's not just about how often you wash your hands, but also how you wash them. Make sure you're using soap and warm water and scrubbing for at least 20 seconds. That's about the time it takes to sing Happy Birthday twice through.
See, there's always a way to make it fun. I'm singing happy birthday to my hands from now on.
I love it. And if you're not able to wash your hands frequently, hand sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol is a good backup plan.
Hand sanitizer is definitely my trusty sidekick during colds and flu season. What about other ways to prevent those germs from spreading?
Covering your coughs and sneezes is crucial. It seems like common sense, but you'd be surprised by how many people don't do it properly. The best way to contain those germs is to cough or sneeze into the crook of your elbow or into a tissue that you immediately throw away.
Right. No more using your hands as germ shields. That's how those viruses spread like wildfire.
Exactly. And equally important, avoid close contact with people who are sick.
Easier said than done, especially when you have kids in school or you work in a busy office. But I guess it's all about being mindful of those personal boundaries.
Precisely. And speaking of boundaries, don't underestimate the power of keeping your hands away from your face, especially your eyes, nose, and mouth.
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm always subconsciously touching my face without even realizing it. It's like a bad habit that's hard to break.
I know, it's definitely easier said than done. But it's worth making a conscious effort, especially when you're in public places or around people who are sick.
Okay, I'll try my best to be more aware of my hand-to-face contact. What about those times when we do start to feel those first sniffles coming on? What can we do to nip it in the bud?
Well, one of the best things you can do for yourself and those around you is to simply stay home when you're sick.
Yeah, the good old Netflix and chill prescription.
Ah.
But seriously, staying home when you're under the weather is probably one of the most selfless acts of kindness we can all do for each other.
Absolutely. It might seem like a small thing, but it can make a world of difference in preventing the spread of those pesky viruses. Plus, giving your body a chance to rest and recover can help shorten the duration of your illness.
And probably makes those sniffles a little more bearable, too.
Exactly. Now, in addition to rest, make sure you're drinking plenty of fluids.
Hydration is key, especially when you're feeling all stuffy and congested.
Exactly. Fluids help thin out mucus and keep those airways clear. And when it comes to managing those pesky symptoms, over-the-counter medications can be helpful. Pain relievers and fever reducers like acetaminophen or ibuprofen can help with those aches and pains and bring down a fever.
And what about decongestants? Those are usually my go-to when I'm feeling all stuffed up.
Decongestants can be helpful for relieving that stuffy nose feeling, but it's important to use them cautiously and only as directed.
Are there any downsides to using decongestants?
They can sometimes cause side effects like insomnia, anxiety, or increased heart rate, especially if used in high doses or for prolonged periods.
So it's always best to check with your doctor or pharmacist to make sure you're using them safely and appropriately.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked when it comes to preventing colds and flu.
Sleep.
Sleep, my favorite topic. But seriously, how important is sleep in all of this? I feel like we always hear about how crucial it is for overall health, but I'm curious about the connection to our immune systems.
Sleep is incredibly important for a healthy immune system. When we don't get enough sleep, our bodies produce less of a protein called cytokine, which helps fight off infection and inflammation.
So skimping on sleep is like giving those viruses a VIP pass into our system.
Pretty much. Aim for 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep each night, especially during cold and flu season.
Noted. I'm making sleep a non-negotiable. It's like a free health hack. What about stress? That's another one that seems to impact everything in our bodies.
You're right. Stress can wreak havoc on our immune systems. When we're stressed, our bodies produce cortisol, a hormone that can suppress immune function. So the more stressed we are, the more vulnerable we become to those winter bugs.
Exactly. Finding healthy ways to manage stress, whether it's through exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, or connecting with loved ones, can make a big difference in supporting your immune system.
Stress management is definitely going on my to-do list right alongside getting enough sleep.
Good plan. Now, we've talked a lot about those everyday habits that can help boost our immune systems, but what about the role of vaccination?
That's a big one, especially when it comes to the flu.
Absolutely. Our sources, particularly the World Health Organization, highlighted the importance of flu vaccination as a critical step in protecting ourselves and our communities.
And I think it's important to remember that even though the flu shot isn't foolproof, it can still significantly reduce your risk of getting sick. And even more importantly, it can lessen the severity of your symptoms if you do happen to catch the flu.
Exactly. It's like putting on a suit of armor before heading into battle. It might not make you invincible, but it significantly increases your chances of coming out on top.
I love that analogy. Okay, so we've covered hand washing, covering our coughs, staying home when we're sick, getting enough sleep, managing stress, and getting vaccinated. Is there anything else we can add to our arsenal of winter wellness weapons?
Well, our source from the Reach Pharmacy article got me thinking about the role that online pharmacies might play in preventing the spread of these winter illnesses.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that connection before. How do online pharmacies factor into all of this?
Well, if you think about it, online pharmacies make healthcare more accessible, especially for people who might have difficulty getting to a traditional pharmacy or doctor's office.
That's a good point. Not everyone has easy access to transportation. And for some people, leaving the house when they're not feeling well could be a real challenge.
Exactly. And if people can easily access over-the-counter medications, reliable information about their symptoms, and even virtual consultations with healthcare professionals from the comfort of their own homes, it stands to reason that they might be less likely to venture out into public spaces while they're contagious.
That's a great point. It could be a game changer, especially for people who might otherwise feel pressured to tough it out and go to work or school while they're sick because they can't easily get to a doctor.
Precisely. It's a fascinating thought to consider as we navigate the challenges of cold and flu season in our increasingly digital world.
It really is. It's like technology is giving us new tools to fight back against those pesky winter bugs.
I love it. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of winter illnesses, I have to say I'm feeling much more informed and empowered. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the nitty-gritty details of how these bugs spread to some surprising facts about prevention and treatment.
And hopefully you feel equipped to make more informed decisions about protecting yourself and your loved ones this winter. Remember, even though there's no way to completely avoid these seasonal bugs, simple things like frequent hand washing, staying home when you're feeling under the weather, and understanding when it's time to seek medical advice can make a world of difference. Absolutely. And hey, even if we do get hit with a cold or the flu this winter, at least we'll be armed with all this newfound knowledge to impress our friends and family.
Exactly. A little knowledge can go a long way.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a topic that's sure to pique your curiosity. It really is amazing how accessible healthcare is becoming. But even with all these new tools and all this knowledge, we still haven't cracked the code on completely avoiding those winter bugs, have we?
Not quite yet. But armed with what we've learned today, we can definitely be smarter about how we navigate cold and flu season. We've talked a lot about prevention, but knowing how to handle those early days when you start to feel those telltale symptoms is key. It's all about listening to your body and responding in a way that supports its natural healing process.
Like hitting the pause button and giving yourself permission to rest.
Exactly. It's amazing how often we try to power through those early signs of a cold or the flu, pushing ourselves to keep going when our bodies are screaming for a timeout.
It's true. We often feel this pressure to be productive and keep up with our busy schedules, even when we're feeling under the weather. But maybe sometimes the most productive thing we can do is actually slow down and rest.
I couldn't agree more. It's about shifting our mindset from one of pushing through to one of prioritizing self-care. Think of it this way. When you're feeling run down, your body is working overtime to fight off those invading viruses. Giving it a chance to rest and recharge can make a world of difference in how quickly you bounce back.
That's a great way to look at it. So rest is at the top of the list.
Yeah.
What else can we do to support our bodies during those early stages of a cold or the flu?
Hydration is key. When you're sick, your body loses fluids more quickly, especially if you have a fever. Staying hydrated helps thin out mucus, keeps your throat from feeling scratchy, and it helps your body flush out those toxins.
Okay, so water is our best friend when those sniffles hit.
Absolutely. Aim for 8 glasses a day, or even more if you can manage it. And don't be afraid to get creative with your fluids. Warm water with lemon and honey can be soothing for a sore throat, and broths and soups can be both hydrating and nourishing. Herbal teas are also a great option, especially those with ginger or peppermint, which can help soothe an upset stomach.
These are great tips. It's amazing how much better you can feel when you're properly hydrated. What about over-the-counter medications? Are those ever a good idea?
They can be helpful in managing those pesky symptoms, but it's essential to use them cautiously and only as directed. Pain relievers like acetaminophen or ibuprofen can help with those aches, pains, and fever. And if you're dealing with congestion, a decongestant might provide some relief, but again, it's important to use them sparingly and pay attention to any potential side effects.
So moderation and listening to your body are key. What about those natural remedies that people swear by? We've already debunked a few, but is there anything that actually holds up to the science?
We talked about honey for coughs, and that one does have some scientific backing, particularly for children over the age of 1. It seems to work by coating and seething the throat, and there's some evidence to suggest that gargling with salt water might help soothe a sore throat and reduce inflammation.
See, Grandma was right about gargling with salt water. It's like a rite of passage for any sore throat. What about zinc? We touched on that earlier.
Right. There is some limited evidence to suggest that oral zinc supplements might help reduce the duration of a cold, but the research is still inconclusive. And it's important to reiterate that nasal zinc sprays are a definite no-no due to the risk of permanent loss of smell.
Got it. So when it comes to those home remedies, it's always best to proceed with caution and do your research before trying anything new.
Absolutely. And if you have any concerns or questions, reach out to your doctor or pharmacist for guidance. They can help you weigh the potential benefits and risks and determine if a particular remedy is right for you.
Solid advice. Now let's zoom out for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. We've explored the science behind these winter illnesses, debunked some common myths, and armed ourselves with prevention strategies and symptom management tips. But what does this all mean for us as individuals and as a society?
That's a great question. I think this deep dive highlights the interconnectedness of our health, our environment, and our behaviors. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. When we take steps to protect ourselves from getting sick, like washing our hands, covering our coughs, and staying home when we're contagious, we're also protecting our communities, especially those who are most vulnerable.
It's like a ripple effect of wellness.
Exactly. And I think it also underscores the importance of staying informed and being proactive about our health. We live in an age where we have access to more information than ever before, but it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all. Taking the time to educate ourselves about these common illnesses, separating fact from fiction, and making healthy choices can make a world of difference in how we navigate cold and flu season.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge truly is power, especially when it comes to our health. And maybe, just maybe, by being more mindful of our actions and making those small but impactful changes to our daily routines, we can create a future where those winter bugs have a much harder time spreading their germs.
Now that's a future I can get behind. Imagine a world where cold and flu season is a little less daunting and a lot less sniffly.
I love it. Well, on that optimistic note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of winter illnesses. Hopefully you feel as informed and empowered as I do. And remember, even though we can't completely avoid those pesky viruses, we can certainly face them with a newfound sense of knowledge and a whole arsenal of wellness weapons at our disposal.
Absolutely. And as always, remember to consult with your healthcare provider for personalized advice and treatment options.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for this fascinating exploration of winter woes. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a topic that's sure to pique your curiosity.
Thank you for listening. Visit reachpharmacy.com, your go-to online pharmacy for all your medical needs in the UK.